All right. I want to show you one other thing that's sort of interesting. We just discovered this recently. I should say we didn't discover it. Somebody found it in their attic and gave it to us. This is it's a photocopy of the top of a newspaper printed here in Springfield in 1927. It's called the Illinois Chronicle. It was for African Americans. And here's the little cartoon that they thought represented their life in the 60 years since Lincoln had been president. Up here, it shows this poor family walking along the road carrying all their goods in a bundle, and it says 60 years ago, emancipation. And then over here, this man says, not so bad in 60 years. And it says there are 80 Negro-owned banks in the country with $11 million of assets, $20 million in resources, 80 Negro-owned insurance companies, contributors to world progress, Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Benjamin Banneker, George Washington Carver, Paul Laurence Dunbar. Lincoln only knew one of them, Frederick Douglass, but the others came later. And that's the way people thought of him just 60 years after. Now we're about 80 years past that, and we still think he did a lot for world progress. Okay. Ms. Shotwell, are we ready for questions? Okay. Have I left anything out? Yes.
I actually had a question that was early on. How long do you think it would take Lincoln to scrape and save money to make that boat?
Good question. How long would it take him to make enough money to build that boat? I think a lot of the lumber was cast off, was just scrap lumber. I said earlier that his father was a pretty good carpenter. When they got to Indiana, his father got hired to do some fairly good work. He made nice furniture for a doctor and a lawyer in their county. He also helped build the church that the Lincolns started going to. So there was plenty of scrap lumber left from that. As far as nails, well, maybe his father gave him some. But his father was said to have the best carpenter's toolkit in the county. So he probably had a few extra nails that he could let his son have. Yes? Mm-hmm. Well, good question. You never stopped chopping wood here. I thought about it this morning when I got up, and the temperature was about, 11 degrees this morning? And I thought, I am so glad that I don't live in that little cabin where the Lincolns lived with no central heat. One good thing about having a tiny cabin full of people is that it was easier to warm. You had one fireplace at the end. You throw it through there. And they've had the fire going nonstop for probably 8 months of the year. And so the other reason to chop wood all the time is to build fence rails, all those split rail fences that Lincoln was famous for, and that's how he got the name, the rail splitter, from putting them all along the land that people were claiming so that their animals wouldn't run away. Yes?
If their houses were made of wood, why would they put fire in their houses?
Good question. Most houses had a brick chimney. It's the first thing that got built. In some parts of the country, it was made of stone. Places where there wasn't enough of either of those, they would use mud or clay. And it was a danger. House fires were much, much more common in those days than they are now. Good question. Yeah?
I read in a book that during the Civil War, Kentucky was loyal to the Union.
I'm sorry, what was the end of that during the war?
That Kentucky was loyal to the Union.
That's right. Kentucky was technically loyal to the Union, but it was one of the four, what Mr. Lincoln called the border states. There were 11 states in the South that seceded from the Union and formed the Confederacy. Then there were the 22 states in the North that remained loyal to the Union, where there was no slavery. But Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware all allowed slavery, but they did not split from the country. They stayed in the Union, and the most important job that Mr. Lincoln had to do really was to keep them in the country. A lot of the war was fought in Missouri and Kentucky and a little bit of it in Maryland. Probably a majority of the people who lived in those states favored slavery, and even some of them favored the Confederacy, but the political leaders, for the most part, did not and kept them loyal to President Lincoln and the Union in Washington. It was very hard. Good question. You've had too many. Yes?
Back then, did they have, how much, back then was $1, back then, $100 now?
Good question. Roughly, we use the figure of 50 to multiply what things are worth now compared to worth then. But it's very different, though. In other words, if and this was fairly typical, a new book cost $1, might cost $50 now. It'd be a fairly nice one. I'm trying to think of a good example. A pound of pork. All the farmers around Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois kept pigs and sold pork to the big traders in St. Louis to be distributed in the cities. Well, pork ran maybe 25 cents a pound. You can't multiply that by 25 cents and get today's prices, unfortunately, because there is so much more of it produced. So some things have become much cheaper. Postage has become much cheaper. I said it costs 3 cents to mail a letter now. Multiply that by 50 cents, you'd have $1.50. But it doesn't cost that. It costs 44 cents to mail a letter now. So some things are cheaper. Houses are more. Gasoline, they didn't have gasoline. CDs, they didn't have CDs. But it varied a lot. But that's a good question. Use the figure of 50 when you're multiplying. Yeah?
What do you think would have happened if the North lost the Civil War?
Well, good question. What's known as hypothetical history or counterfactual history. The fact is the North won the war, but if it had not, undoubtedly slavery would have kept going in the southern states for at least another generation, maybe two. Remember, this was not the only country that had slavery. By 1865, when slavery officially ended in this country, there were still Cuba and Brazil in the Western Hemisphere that had slaves, and Brazil always had by far more slaves than the United States did. And it didn't end there until 1888, 23 years after it ended here. It's hard to say. It would have ruined the country. It would have been much harder for the two parts of the country ever to get back together, I guess. It's worth thinking about. Yeah?
Do you know exactly what kind of trees Lincoln would have chopped?
Oh, lots. The trees that were most common in the areas where they lived were hickory, maple, oak, ash. Oak was nice for making furniture. Cherry wood was really nice for making furniture. There's a nice desk that his father, Thomas Lincoln, made out of cherry wood. So people tended not to burn cherry wood. Yes?
You said when they lived in Kentucky, they made things out of wood, like desks.
Yeah. They made everything they had.
Did they do that when they moved to Indiana?
A little bit, but as more people came into the area, they were able to buy things. There were traveling salesmen. They couldn't make their own books, for example. They did apparently have the chance to buy a new or used book once or twice when Lincoln came through. And he only went to school for a total of 9 months in his whole life. And he apparently borrowed books then. He didn't actually own his school books. Yeah?